Abdul, thank you for being with us. We're speaking today with Abdul Omari, who is principal and founder of AMO, which provides counseling, mentoring, training in the area of equity, inclusion, diversity, and leadership. So thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely.
So, Abdul, tell me about yourself and about AMO.
Yeah, certainly. Starting with myself, I am from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I still reside now, and born to immigrant parents from Kenya and Jordan, and grew up here through the school system, siblings around here, ended up at the University of Minnesota for undergrad, master's, and then a PhD. And, spend most of my kind of working time around engagement. Civic life is usually through boards, again, where we met when I was probably transitioning out of 6 years of a term as an elected trustee at the University of Minnesota. Kind of my last big thing that I did prior to not being reelected to the position was leading the search for the current president, Joan Gable, and worked with AGB, again, by way of kind of our introduction. From a work standpoint, back in 2013, when I was still in my doctorate program, I started a leadership development company, thinking that perhaps I could run some workshops with high school students, make some money. And then that kind of transitioned when I was graduating. I decided I wanted to do it full time. And the work really shows up in the form of a lot of workshop seminars, keynotes, in what I call leadership development and the inseparable ties to equity, inclusion, and diversity. So trying to merge the two together, and working with clients these days across the spectrum: higher ed, K-12, government, a lot of government, finance industry, corporate, you name it. So that's where I'm at now. The mentoring piece, I usually talk about it more as like in an advising role. But the link to mentoring is that I actually did my research study around the perceptions of mentoring. And all of this ties together in my mind because it's all about how we build relationships and connect with people.
So your doctorate, what was the dissertation?
Yeah, so the program was comparative and international education. The study was looking at the perceptions of mentoring using a cultural intelligence framework. And so I did a qualitative study with a mentoring program that I was in as a high school student, the same program I later went on to become a mentor. And then I used a sample from that program to do about 16 in-depth qualitative interviews and interpreted the data based on that.
Let's talk a little bit about the pandemic first.
Yep.
And then I do want to talk about your view of EID and how you've incorporated that into your work. But how is when we spoke, the pandemic was, obviously in place in our society. How has it affected you, both personally, professionally? Any words of wisdom that you would say, looking at it in the rearview mirror, having gone through it for 8 months, this is my perception of it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe I'll start professionally. So, my business is an in-person business. Well, it was. I was used to being in front of crowds and in big groups of people, on a daily basis almost. And so, mid to late March, when things in Minnesota in particular started shutting down, because the biggest base of my work is here, I was looking at like 50% revenues gone. And so, I was kind of crunching numbers saying, all right, well, you can pay the bills and then, you might be okay, but you can't do anything else. And then after that, I think April and early May started to roll around. And as you said, we kind of thought it was going to be 3 months, but for a lot of organizations, they were saying, well, we've got these budgets. We planned on doing, growth and development work with our people, so we should probably still do it, and we'll just have to adjust to a virtual environment. And so then clients started calling again. And then, the kind of odd feeling that I will always maintain, kind of how this went about is, after George Floyd was murdered, then my phone started ringing nonstop. And so folks were kind of like, hey, you had told us about how like leadership development and like diversity and equity kind of go together. Can you tell us about that again? And so you almost laugh like, you're like, man, I was trying to tell y'all this a while ago. And so, but anyway, so then business significantly spiked. And now I would say it's kind of evened out in a way that's more balanced. But the good thing was, early on, like I said, in April, early May, I started reaching out to clients saying, not ideal, but I'm equipped to do all of these sessions virtually that we were doing before. And again, some started kind of reaching back and calling back in April and May. Personally, I'm one that's used to being on a flight, several times a month, whether it's professionally or personal. Actually more personal, to be honest with you, because I love to travel. So that's been a challenge. And I'm very, outgoing. I'm always out somewhere at a bar, at a restaurant, or what have you. But at the end of the day, I always come back to two things. People ask me how I'm doing, and I say I'm working, and my family's healthy thus far. And so when I can answer, in that way, I certainly feel fortunate to be able to say that. So from a personal standpoint, certainly challenging, like for most of us, but healthy and working. So feel good about that. And then the kind of third part of your question, I thought you said, and please help me out if I didn't catch it right, but kind of what are my reflections and on things.
Yeah, in the rearview mirror kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly one of those things where you certainly wish that we could have, as a nation, gotten more in alignment together and seeing if we could have more quickly move things along as far as the containment, or whatever term you want to use. And I think as you look back pre-pandemic, I kind of think about how much stuff I did or have that I just don't need, and appreciate some of the small things. And for example, I just purged my closet, and I got a bunch of students that I teach at the collegiate level, and I was like, hey, who wears X size? Come, sift through all this stuff. So there's certainly, like, I think for me a overall perspective on things that is humbling and kind of brings things back. And then I'd say, looking back on it, I think it's been pretty impressive to see how folks have been innovative and adjusted and found, new lines of business, new ways to offer their business services. Not different from me saying I can adjust to virtual, but folks have completely changed their business models, which has been pretty exciting. So that's a fascinating one. And then, coming back to the perspective that I have on, looking at the things that I may not need or the things that I want, we really saw on full display the challenges that we have in our nation around, poverty and basic necessities of folks, whether it's, access to healthy foods or internet service. I feel really sad for kids and for young people. And I think that, the pandemic highlighted a lot of what we already knew, but in a way that, at least to me, seems a lot harder to ignore. Feeling sad for our young people, certainly.
And you grew up in Minneapolis, the Minneapolis area.
That's right. Yep.
Talk to me about that. Just talk to me about the experience of growing up, in your family, in that community.
Yeah, certainly. So one other, I think at least fascinating caveat to not only having, immigrant parents, one from the Middle East, one from East Africa, and then growing up in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the 80s and 90s, is that they're actually, one parent is Muslim and one parent is Greek Orthodox Christian. And so, when I think about my childhood, it was certainly one of, navigating these multiple identifiers, where, you have a Muslim name, you affiliate more with Christianity, you show up as like a Black American, but then, you have immigrant parents, and what does that mean, and how does that play out? I remember in high school, and you may not know this, but Minnesota has the highest number of Somali people outside of East Africa. And so when I was in high school, there was one high school in Minneapolis where most of the East Africans ended up in first, and then they started coming to my high school. And I like vividly remember coming back my junior year of high school, and like you could see in the hallways the shift in demographics. And as I talk to people, especially like a lot of times it was the kind of elders, I used to work at Marshall Fields, now Macy's. And I remember some older East Africans would ask me where I'm from, especially when they saw my name tag, right? They saw Abdul and they'd ask me, and I'd say I'm from Kenya. And it would kind of turn into this, I don't want to say hostile, but they'd get a little offended. And, they would assume that I was from Somalia. By way of, so Somalian ended up in Kenya through the war and was kind of denying my roots, right? And so I remember one day asking my dad, I was like, Dad, why does everybody keep telling me that we're from Somalia? And he's like, no, we're actually Kenyan. I was born and raised there. We're not not in a way that was like, no, we're not Somali, but just like, that's not our heritage. So to be quite honest, it was growing up confused, right? Like, am I Black? Am I an immigrant? Am I Middle Eastern? Am I Christian? Am I Muslim? Which I think has translated really well into my work and into the ways in which I try to, connect with other people, because I've kind of done that deep by way of necessity, almost digging and thinking about my roots and my background and how that shows up in different contexts.
How in any way did you find yourself participating, either actively or passively, in the events surrounding George Floyd's death?
Yeah. So, after he was killed, it was interesting for me. It was interesting in a different way for everybody, but there were, moments of like significantly shifting emotions and thoughts and feelings throughout. And I certainly went to several protests. I certainly my high school is, 3 blocks from the precinct that got burned down. It's 3 blocks from kind of what they, not where the actual murder was, but like where the like primary kind of destruction took place, where there was like a cut of food, a grocery store and a Target store, all 3 blocks from where I went to high school. I mean, that was, Saturday, Sunday shopping. We went to the 3 grocery stores and to Target right there, depending on where the coupons were. So went down several times, looked at, different things that were happening. But I think, I experienced things very differently from, especially, the media, in that, or mainstream media, I'll say, in that, this was still a time where I was looking at 50% revenues, counting budgets, right, and numbers. And yeah. when I went down to the Target the very day after like the first big kind of looting took place, I saw people walking out of there with like diapers and canned food items, right? It wasn't TVs. It wasn't, these other things that kind of were being portrayed on the mainstream media. And I thought to myself later on, I was like, man, I easily could have been looking for food, right? I easily could have been, out of, the ability to feed myself because of the pandemic, not, simply because of the pandemic, or not simply because it's not simple, but, and I saw people, I think I got down there one time at about 10 a.m. to try and help clean up, and pretty much everything was cleaned. And I was like, how did this happen? Who was out here this early? And there was a sense of like major pride that you saw, right? And it wasn't, folks just trying to be destructive. So that's a little bit of context there. But so certainly took place in some protests. I think most of my engagement, I would say, was for me in a working space, because a lot of what happened was new and former clients called and said, Abdul, can you help us understand what's going on? Can you talk to our employees? Can you do a town hall session? Can you do a listening and dialogue session to help folks make sense, to help folks bond, to help folks, talk about their confusion, whatever it is that they're doing. So I think my engagement very much showed up in helping other folks move along the spectrum of processing.
So
if that makes sense.
yeah, so the kind of work you did, let's say before the pandemic and before the murder of George Floyd, was kind of in one area, and it's evolved as a result of both in terms of the delivery of the information, the delivery of the training, and also the content.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And much of the content shift is more around like, it's like less prepared material, right? It's like, we just want to kind of talk to you. We just kind of want to figure out, one, can you give us your perspective? Like, what have you been feeling as somebody who's from there, was there as a Black man, all these things. And then two, like, just help us understand how these things have happened, how to view them, what to think of them. And then certainly with most organizations and partnerships that I have, it's like, okay, now, can you also come back to some of the content that you had before around bias, around power, privilege, those types of things, and kind of deliver that content as well?
Okay. So my whole life has been spent working with nonprofits and helping nonprofits advance their mission. Now, a key component to that is the involvement of volunteers. So from your perspective, I am sure that you work with organizations where you're dealing with leadership abilities, issues around equity, inclusion, and diversity that are with people who are paid to do their job. And then so we have some of those too. We have people that are professional fundraising executives, professional advancement executives, and they need leadership help without question.
Yep.
Then the other thing is, how do they manage volunteers? Because managing a volunteer is very different than managing somebody who gets a paycheck every week. Can you speak to that at all? Have you had to pivot, which is the new word that everyone likes to use, between working with people who are paid to do something and you're helping them to get better at their job or understand issues around diversity better, versus people who are volunteers and have a responsibility because they put up their hand and they say, I want to help, but they really don't know what to do. Any comments, any thoughts on that?
Well, so I think that I've certainly worked with a lot of folks who are managing volunteers or what have you. We've never put as fine of a focus as you just mentioned. But I think that, one of the things that is important in the conversation, well, I'll probably say a few as I get flowing, so not just one, but the people who volunteer, right? I think the important thing is that we know that they are volunteering because they feel strongly about whatever the mission or topic or what have you is, right? Yep. And we start there. And the thing that I also believe is important is to recognize that those who volunteer are also getting something out of the experience. Whether it's just, I sleep better at night, I feel good about myself, I feel like I'm moving whatever the topic or issue is forward. And to not treat them, what I would actually say is almost insulting, as like this, person who is just the greatest ever and 100% selfless, and, but that we have to also hold you accountable, even if you are spending your volunteer time doing it, right? And so, having said that, I think that oftentimes volunteers will show up in a way that is always eager to learn and eager to expand, but there's always the fallback of, well, I'm just volunteering, right? Like, I don't have to do too much, or we can't ask of you to, have an extension of growth and development in the same way that we are, or what have you. And I don't think we can approach it in that way. I think we also have to be mindful that they are there and they are also receiving something out of it in a way that is valuable to them as an individual, or the cause that, or their values, or what have you. So I think that's important. I also think that, or I would say that the work for me, as it comes to volunteers, more than helping paid employees think about how they work with volunteers, has been about an organization hiring me to work directly with their volunteers, right? To say, you're going to do growth and development for our staff and for those that are volunteering, whether it's their board or their actual, volunteer base. So educational organization, it's their tutors or what have you. And in that work, when it's shown up, I would say I have the capability to walk on fewer eggshells than the person who needs the volunteers to carry out their mission, right? So I can come in and talk to volunteers and educate them and push back in a different way than a staff person can, because a staff person might be afraid to offend, thereby losing their base of volunteers, right? And so in some of those engagements, I'd say the growth has been fascinating, and it's been fun, and it's been challenging, and uncomfortable, and all of those things. But yet, I think productive and valuable.
The other thing that you would have to rely on and kind of become part of the discussion is your work as a volunteer. So you can say, it's not just I'm telling you to do something. I've done that. I've been in your place. When we engage volunteers for a board position or a campaign committee for a capital campaign and everything in between, we would tell them specifically, this is all part of the onboarding. This is what your duties and responsibilities will be, and do you agree with that? So in theory, they'll say yes, but then when the actual practice comes into play, you realize that they're uncomfortable or afraid or can't do what they thought they could do.
Absolutely.
When you were, I didn't get to this earlier, but you were a member of the trustees at the University of Minnesota.
That's right.
And you used the word elected. Were you elected or appointed by the governor?
We are elected by our state legislature, actually. So
okay.
one of the few states that, there's some appointment and then confirmed by Senate, stuff like that. We actually have the 201 legislators from the House and State Senate that vote. And so you need 101 to be elected.
And you were either appointed or elected to chair the search committee. Is that correct?
That's right. So in this case, the chair and vice chair of the board, of the overall board, appointed me to be the chair of the search committee that was searching for the current president.
And how long did you serve as a member of the Board of Regents?
6 years. And
are there term limits?
There are not, actually. So there's not term limits. The standard in modern day, I'd say since the 2000s, I don't know exactly if this number would be true, but is that people serve 2 terms and then cycle off. There's been some unique situations where one person had gotten elected in a 3rd term in the last 10 years or so and served half of it and then stepped down.
How long is a term? 6
years. So, you figure if you're serving 2 terms, 12 years is a long time. And I think most people, at least in kind of the most recent past, have said, all right, that's good enough for me.
Speaking of diversity, equity, inclusion, one of the things that we struggle with in New Jersey is that Ramapo prides itself in its diversity. But when you look at the board of trustees at Ramapo, they don't look very diverse at all. They all look like me. You know, there's 2 women and there's probably 7 or 8 white men. And we, for us to try to make an impact on that, we have to go periodically and lobby the governor's office, because while the governor ultimately appoints, he requires confirmation from the Senate.
Okay.
So it, you know, there is a kind of a 2-step process. How about in Minnesota, when you're trying to create a sense of diversity for the Board of Regents at the University of Minnesota, or even the other state schools, is there any recourse on the part of the school?
So the school is supposed to remain completely out of the loop. The president, you know, which makes sense, right? Like, you can't lobby for anyone. You're not supposed to have any sort of influence, because, you know, if you're lobbying against or for an opponent of someone that then wins an election, that person becomes your boss, right? So, like, you're kind of out of it. So just to give you some context, so the University of Minnesota started in 1851. And when I got elected in 2013, I was the 7th Black regent.
Ever.
Yeah. And so, you know, that's just a little context there. We also have a large Hmong population. And I know, so in this latest election, a Hmong woman was elected. My understanding, she's the first Hmong person to ever be elected. The person before me in my seat is a Latino woman, and she was the first Latino person to be elected, which would have been 2007. The other fascinating thing, and this is going to get into some of the kind of semantics, but I think is worth bringing up. So of those 4 of the 4 at-large seats, one of those at-larges has to be a student at the time of election, right? But you go through the same election process, you have the same term, you have the same voting rights, all of that. I was in that seat, so I was in the student seat. And then when you finish, if you graduate while you're while you're still in the seat, you carry your term. So I graduated 2 years into my term, and then I stayed on as a regent. The other fascinating dynamic.
You were a graduate student, is that correct?
Correct. I was in my doctorate program. Yep. It can be an undergrad student though. And so what's fascinating though, and I think is important to the conversation when you bring up diversity, is so in the past, if you look at now there's a 3rd Black person. So 3 of the 8 now Black people who have been regents have all been in that student seat. So, and then the Latino woman that I mentioned was also in the student seat. And so if you kind of think of it in that way, it almost is like, oh, well, we can put the young student in that seat if they're a person of color. But when it gets into these other areas, it's a little more, right, a bit more of a dynamic conversation. And so I think that's important, because certainly I would say even early on in my time on the board, it was very much like, oh, he's the student regent. Like, meet the student regent, right? No one ever said like, meet the 1st district regent, right? But it was always like, oh, it's the student, you know? And so I think that that's an important, you know, nuance that is a part of the conversation too.
So a couple of other things about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we do something at Ramapo College, where we have put our trustees through a training, and I've experienced it, and I found it to be illuminating and very helpful, even in terms of the way you use pronouns, the way you describe people, little things like that. We've talked about it at a firm level. We have a statement that our firm promotes and articulates. We think that's certainly important. How have you remained? This had to have been, it's been tough for, I don't want to turn this partisan at all.
Yeah.
But this has been very, very tough for me as a citizen the
Mm-hmm.
last few years.
Mm-hmm.
I have a tough time wrapping my head around it. A person like yourself, whose parents came from, Jordan and Kenya, with all of the things that have been said and done in our country. I guess the question is, how have you remained positive? What do you
Yeah.
draw? What do you draw upon that keeps you kind of grounded?
Yeah. Yeah. So you're right. It has been very challenging and it has been tough. And it's, I think, so first thing I'll say is, I'm very fortunate to have just great people around me. I have great friends. I have great family. In many ways, I didn't do anything to get to be this lucky to have a great family and great friends and great support systems and what have you. So you certainly draw on them by all means. And I think to stay. So one of the things that I think is unique, and I should say, like, I want to make sure that there's some things that I might say that I word them as like kind of broad and maybe sweeping across more than just my own perspective, but also that there is no monolithic experience, right? And so everybody has their own, right? So I want to kind of show those two things. I'll also say, like, it's exhausting, and also people who have had or have the identifiers in the Western world and in the United States that typically lead to different forms of oppression are kind of used to it. And it doesn't mean that it's not exhausting. It doesn't mean that it's not heartbreaking. It doesn't mean that it's not hard. But there's a certain like coat of armor that goes up and continues to stay up and be refreshed and sharpened and hardened as we continue to see some of the negative outcomes, the inequitable outcomes. Having said that, I also know that in my work, I have these moments of breakthrough with individuals that is probably the biggest way that keeps me positive. So it's 2 years after running a session with an organization or a small group of people that you get the random email that says, "Hey, you probably don't remember me. I was in the crowd with 250 other people, and I walked into that session about cultural intelligence, and I was like, this dude's gonna yell at me and call me sexist and call me racist and what have you." And then they say, "I walked out and I've continued to do research and I've continued to check in with myself and build myself, and I wouldn't have done that had I not been in your session." It's the work.
Let me interrupt you. Was that person a person of color or white?
White. Yeah.
Okay. I need to drill down on that. I need to drill down on that.
Yeah. And I'll also say this, right? Like, I tell people of color all the time too, just because you're a person of color don't mean you're helping the cause, right? Like, we can't just say, "Oh, well, I show up as brown or black and therefore I am, I don't need to do any work either." Right? Like, you talked earlier about pronouns, right? And like, this is a different form of diversity, and it's a different form of being inclusionary or inclusive and equitable. But like, everyone has to do some work, right? And now some of us might be on a different place of the spectrum, but you can't just show up and assume because you have an identifier that might be oppressed at times that you don't have to do any work. Right. So I think that's important too. But yes, to answer your question, yes, it was a white person.
So let me just make a point, kind of a couple of points about what you're talking about, and that is one of the things I'm sure I'm criticized for is that I have a tremendous amount of admiration and respect for my 3 children, both what they've done personally and professionally. My daughter is head of fundraising, head of advancement for a very elite private school in New York City,
okay.
Called the Buckley School, and she has been, I believe it's fair to say, a strong proponent at that school for promoting, all the issues around diversity. Racial injustice, equity, inclusion, etc. And she and I talk about it a lot. And while a large part of her population is is white. It's not all, and it's not all people of privilege, because they do have
Yeah.
scholarship kids.
Yeah.
And that's something that she has recognized is very, very important, and she pushes and pushes and pushes, and I think does an effective job. I have somebody else in my life who is a friend and a colleague, and when we talk about this, his reaction is, I don't want to. It's a white man. I don't want to be made to feel bad because I'm white.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that I'm very open to diversity and to racial justice.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and I said, that's fine, but I think we can all grow through, possibly the kind of work that you do and others.
Right.
And others.
Right.
How do you respond to that? The second, not the first. The white man saying,
Well, quite honestly, I don't want you to feel bad either. Because if you feel bad, you certainly aren't going to do anything to try and make things better in the world, right? Like, and I have been one to say, oftentimes the term that people associate with that is white guilt, right? And I always tell people, like, if that's a feeling that you have, you need to have your feeling. Like, I will never tell you to feel a different way, right? But what I also want you to do is have that feeling, address it, ask questions about why you feel that way, and then try and move beyond it, right? And so when you move beyond it, it's saying, okay, I feel this way because people are telling me that I have some unearned advantages by being X in this country, right? For me, for example, it's being a man, right? Like, that is, I didn't do anything to get, a higher salary in the same role as a woman, right? I'm just a man and I benefit from that. So now that I know that, I've gone through, okay, I feel bad about that. That's terrible. What can I do about it? Well, if I'm the principal and partner of a company that employs 10 people or 500 people or 1,000 people, I can do a pay equity audit, right? So I know this now. I've gone from feeling bad about it, knowing that it's not right, to saying now I can actually do something about it. So that's kind of what I would respond to that. And then coming back to your other question though about, like, what are the things that keep me going? I'm also very fortunate to have an active civic life, and it more than anything, really shows up in boards and in board service. So from small nonprofits to larger organizations like the University of Minnesota, and those are really, really I think impactful roles that I serve in, where I see young people, where I see poor people who are having different opportunities and ways to engage with the world and be involved in the process and at the table, whether it's, sourcing for boards, which I actually really love to do, and seeing people thrive on boards, or, being on search committees, small to large. Matter of fact, the Alumni Association at the U asked me to help them with their nominations process. So I got our first meeting with them later today. So there's a lot of reward in that. And then the last thing, and I promise I'll be done with this part, is my two other outlets are my nieces and nephews. And in the world of a pandemic, it gets a lot harder to spend time with them. But being with them, seeing them, that's why I do the work that I do. And then, staying physically healthy. So bike riding, now it's a lot harder in the winter time, but finding ways to stay healthy and from a physical standpoint as well.
Yeah. Well, I think what's going to happen, Abdul, is we're going to conclude this, but I want to spend time with you in the future, because I want to see the potential synergy between what you do and what we do. And I think while we can speak a lot about the do's and the don'ts, the pluses and the minuses around behavior, I think leadership plays a part in that.
Absolutely.
And sometimes it's as simple as the person recognizing the responsibility to lead.
Absolutely.
They don't think of themselves in that way. And I'm
Exactly.
sure so that's well, look, it was great getting to know you. We'll continue to stay in touch. Yeah. And I hope when you see this, I hope you have the opportunity to send it to your your network. I think it would be great.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
I appreciate it. Good to
Thank
talk.
you,
Good to
Abdul.
see you. Yeah,
Good
take care.
seeing you. Thank you.